Hello, everybody. Welcome to our panel. Today's panel is called Digital Leadership in the Age of Uncertainty, Real-World Applications and the New Normal. Our panelists today are Peter Dorrington, who is going to pop up in a moment, founder of Exemplify Consulting. Hello, Peter.
Hello.
We have Steve Kennett, who's the Interim Executive Director, E-Infrastructure and Zero at JISC.
Hello.
Hello. And we have Inder Phul, who is the CEO at Graphite.
Hello.
Hello. This session is going to be moderated by John Morton, who's the founder at CPM Consulting.
So, I think the first thing we should do, gentlemen, is introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your perspective on today's subject and where your opinion is coming from. I'll start with an old friend of mine. Sorry, a long-term friend. He's not old. Peter.
Thank you, John. I'm not that young, so I don't take it personally. So my name is Peter. I'm the founder of Exemplify Consulting. And John and I have had a long history together in data analytics. What I'm interested in at the moment, though, is the combination of data science and behavioral science, trying to answer the question, why do people do what they do, and what are they going to do next? And to do that, I'm using a combination of natural language processing with looking at operational and transactional data and finding ways to build really interesting agile segments for users, particularly consumers. And I call that predictive behavioral analytics. So the real secret sauce there is really getting into the minds of motivation and what that means in terms of what people do when they transact with your organization. Thank you.
Okay. And Inder, what's your perspective?
Thanks, John. So I'm Inder. I run a company called Graphite. We are a global partnership agency, really specializing in the intersection between music and entertainment. I think for this talk, my perspective is really looking at changing consumer behavior and how this current pandemic is kind of changing the way people engage with content online and also opening up new opportunities to learn from what's happening in the gaming industry and the music industry and how that can be potentially applied to other sectors as well.
I'm going to pop in every now and again if John goes down. And so if you see me doing that, that's all that's happening. So Steve, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Robin. Hello, I'm Steve. I work for JISC. I provide the United Kingdom's National Research Education Network. We connect 1,200 institutions. That's all higher education, further education, and research institutions in the United Kingdom. So at any one time, in a normal situation, we've got 18 million users online at any one time. My particular directorate provides the network, cybersecurity, cloud offerings, and some training. So my view on this is, I'm interested from technology point of view, is we've made a big step off the digital cliff into remote working and accessing, but also I'm interested in the security aspects of that and the information security management around that, and what are people doing? Are they aware of the risks and what happens? So for me, in my world, that's the big question at the moment.
Great. Thank you, Steve. So I think we're going to really kick off. If John comes back, he'll pop back in, I'm sure. But we've had a couple of questions from the audience in advance and sort of shaped this panel a little bit with a lot of the current challenges. And we've put it into a couple of different sections. So one of the sections that I'm going to start us off with is strategic planning and execution in uncertain time. And this is sort of around what we can do to mitigate the risk. Will this accelerate digital transformation, AI automation? How do we educate and train remote employees in soft skills? And sort of with this scramble to respond to the coronavirus, are we making short-term decisions that have long-term implications? So who would like to start off on that subject?
Oh, I'll go.
Oh,
So, sorry, Steve. In answer to the question, then, well, inevitably, we're having to take short-term actions and decisions simply to deal with the operational implications of COVID-19. And we've heard from a couple of the speakers this morning that's had some effects in terms of access to technology, to bandwidth. But the area that I was interested in is, what is it doing to people? Isolation is not normal for us. And I think there's a temptation to leap to, hey, this is a great idea. Let's have lots of people working from home, without really thinking about how we support those individuals in terms of their productivity, as well as just getting stuff done, but also with their well-being and health, particularly mental health. And we're already seeing reports of things like stress. So, yeah, we're making some decisions. I think there is a dash to digital right now, which was interesting when there were reports pre-COVID-19 that up to 70% of digital transformation programs fail. And that was before we were doing things at speed. So I'll just stop there. And Steve, you had something you wanted to add.
I was going to agree, Peter, a little bit of what you said. We've all sort of accelerated and made the rapid step. From my point of view, I think we all need to stop now, pause and look back, and maybe even just do a risk assessment. And that doesn't just include the technology. I agree, Peter. The staff. I have 165 people all now furiously remote working, including engineers. And it's just making sure, if their days are like mine, back-to-back Zoom meetings or phone calls, that they're actually finding time, one, to stop and pause and reflect on what they're doing, and two, actually to find the time to do some work and feel that they're actually contributing, because most people want to contribute.
Well, I think I'm touching on the mental health one. I thought it was really interesting. I saw some stats today that came out, and apparently on LinkedIn, the posts that have got the most engagement over the past 3 months have included keywords with health, help, people, support, take care. So it's quite interesting that those are actually the topics that even within this period are sort of are driving the most engagement. So it does seem like that actually seems to be a place where people need to initially start looking at, and companies that haven't developed a wellness or well-being program for their employees probably need to start understanding what those could look like.
And it's a pretty stressful time without having to be thrown at working home, maybe balanced on the end of your bed, laptop in hand, camera in the other hand. Just the given current situation that we find ourselves in with COVID, and then all the potentially people unfortunate enough to be furloughed, etc. So there's a lot of things on people's minds, I think, and we, as leaders, I think we ought to take the time to stop and reflect and think about what their requirements are.
Now, I think I'll touch on another aspect that Robin raised when she was introducing this section about e-learning and skills and competence, because this is quite interesting. We've been able to, with a couple of bumps in the road, solve the majority of the process and technology issues. We haven't yet, I think, solved some of the soft skill issues. And one of the areas I've been very interested in for a while is empathy. Not only when we're dealing with colleagues, but also how do we do that over some of these digital channels when we're dealing with customers, particularly right now, when we've got customers who are in themselves stress and distress. So we're having to deal with people who are not only trying to navigate unfamiliar systems, but they're dealing with people whose mindset has changed. And I've been monitoring that for a little while, and I can definitely see culturally there has been a shift in mindset. It's also, I think, quite interesting. We're learning to value things we had, I think, previously taken for granted. But I think for me, e-learning and remote learning in this environment has got to touch on a couple of things. The knowledge, I think we can deal with, the knowing stuff. Skills, well, yeah, we can practice some of that with synthetic environments, with perhaps a little bit of a caveat about soft skills, because there's only so much you can do with AI in that. But I think mindset is perhaps one of the big challenges we've got right now. It's that attitude, you not only can do, but will do and willing to do. And so, I've been looking at this a little bit, and I don't think we've got the whole answer in place yet, but I'd love to hear what the other panelists think about that. So that e-learning, and how do we develop that full spectrum of skills right now, and also prepare for the future. Because we're in a big reset. We're in the world's biggest social experiment, and none of us are quite sure how it's going to work out.
Yeah, interesting, Peter. In my world, the learning thing is exponentially larger because with all the universities, colleges, and even the 28,000 schools we indirectly support, everybody decamped and then tried to figure out how then to generate the learning without the technology. Again, as I say, is quite simple to fix, really. There are plenty of VLE platforms, virtual learning environments, etc. But it's understanding that link that students or pupils or even actually the tutors get from being face to face with their learning classes and environments. And it's been an interesting way to see this. We've also seen a lot of changing in the way that people are accessing that information, because we provide a network which, if you're in a university, college, or you have basically infinite bandwidth. Now that everybody's gone home, we found that people not only have the stress of trying to learn from home in a separate environment, maybe on their own without the peer-to-peer interaction, but also some people, their technology at home, their either fixed wire connection at home or their broadband provider or mobile provider's technology doesn't allow them to download massive amounts of data, particularly if you're stuck with a mobile device that has a data cap on it. There's a whole raft of things here that have triggered without then the angst and stress of either trying to do the work, do well, and submit papers, etc. on the time, depending on where you are in your academic journey.
A key part, which seems obvious, I think was always going to be a challenge with the e-learning, is the element of personalization. When you start trying to scale out, a syllabus or some sort of topic that, hundreds or thousands of people need to access at once, being able to apply it to each individual and their learning style and their set specific job role, I think is going to be a real challenge for companies to try and adapt to create the right systems in place, to appeal to a wider organization.
Yep.
Access to digital materials as well. We provide most of the online journals for the academic sector, and we saw that rise exponentially. The amount of people now trying to download online journals, whereas before you would have the interaction in your class, go onto the library, had a look around and other stuff. It's changing, and I agree with Peter a bit. We sort of stepped off the cliff, and I personally feel that we're still in free fall at the moment. We haven't actually seen the ground yet and understand what that looks like for us.
I guess this brings sort of like really to the forefront the idea that these like policies and ideas have to be put in place in advance. And now it's almost like we were kind of baptism by fire a little bit. And I think that, I don't want to be any doom and gloom about it, but this might be something that happens more often in the future moving forward. So I guess the question is, what do we implement now to make sure that we have everything prepared for if this were to happen, if this happens again, including IT support or technical support, innovations. We have a couple questions actually from the audience that relates to this a little bit that I thought I'd just touch on while we're here. This is a question that actually came up when we were discussing the session beforehand. For example, when you're usually a face-to-face leader, does your skill set need to adjust to be a successful digital leader? What do you guys think? I'm going to bring that over to Inder because I feel you had a lot of things to say about this before when we discussed.
Yeah, I think there's a challenge. I'm going to approach it initially from the sales perspective, because I think, just to give some context, we work in the music industry. I think in terms of remote working and communicating with people globally, it's not really been too different for many people in the music and entertainment sector, where you're constantly dealing with clients, across the globe. The more challenging aspect is when it comes to the sales process, where, you're trying to build a relationship with a client that, the deal might be worth quite a large amount of money. And how do we adapt to creating a modern sales process when you're remote working? And I think that's going to be a very interesting thing to see how whether clients are willing to adapt and actually trust people that they've just met over the internet, or are you comfortable signing a 6-figure or 7-figure deal without ever meeting the person? That's something that we're just watching at the moment and interested to see how that changes.
Peter, do you have any experience with this as well?
I do. I was actually going to wait and let Steve have a chance to chat, and I'll go last. But because I have got some thoughts about this, but I'd love to hear Steve's thoughts first, and then I'll chip in.
Let me hang myself first, Peter. So yeah, I agree slightly with what Inder's saying. If you're looking at this, I'm a pure technologist. So for me, this is great. This is my normal day. My teams, we interact a lot remote. I have remote engineers. However, we were talking about this in the background before, and whether we like it or not, we are social animals, and we're preconditioned to respond to micro ticks and reactions from people and body language. And if you are dealing with that large 6-7 figure sum, if you're that lucky, I mean, there's a horrible expression, did they blink when you mentioned the price? But you miss all those subtle nuances. And I don't think that the technology gives you that. I think you still need that interaction. The question of trust, well, we all stopped shaking hands about a month or so before this came, which for me was a big change because I've always, shake hands. It's just finding whether you can do a digital handshake. But I think people have got to learn and adapt. And I think we underestimate how people will learn and adapt. But I think something Peter mentioned earlier, it's what is the consequence on that to us as individuals and people, and as a social animal that we are. Engineers, we're all fairly solitary, strange people, sit in darkened rooms muttering to our servers all the time. So we might want to take us out of the equation. But particularly, I think even engineers, when we talk in our own language. It's just understanding the subtle nuances. And I suspect this will become even more complex when we start looking internationally again, and how we deal with other cultures and how they perceive and view, because for a lot of cultures that personal touch is very important, and I actually like it, even though I am an engineer and I'm odd like that. But I think that there's things we're going to have to learn, and we're going to have to rewrite the rule book, and it's certainly outside my understanding, but looking to people like Peter and that for advice and guidance, I think is going to be key on how we as leaders move forward into this new age, if you want to call it that.
Okay, now I'll say my Tupney Halfpenny word. So the reason I wanted to let Steve go first is when we were talking offline, he mentioned a very interesting point, which was about the workload. Personally, when you're in a digital environment, it's that constant back-to-back Zoom calls, phone calls, finding ways to make up for some of the slack that we enjoyed in an office environment with that informality. So I'm going to talk on about the effects from a leadership point of view. I think Inda raised great points about sales, and anybody can put up a digital storefront that looks very impressive. So how do you see past that? But I've noticed there's a couple of things that are going on. There's some very specific things about the intensity of how you work on video conferencing, and particularly it's a drive back to structure, efficiency, making good use of your time, because that's a commodity in short supply right now, but that's exhausting. At the same time, we've got people who are feeling very anxious. They're uncertain about the future. And those are two really big motivational drivers, and not least of which economic future doesn't look particularly clear right now. So we're kind of worrying about, well, what will be the world looking like in 6 months' time? And that isn't just affecting employees. Some of the most capable people in business, up to 70%, at one time or another have suffered from something called impostor syndrome. That's that feeling that I'm not quite as good as I think people think I am, and that they're going to find me out at some point. And we're in a perfect storm for those people who are going through right now a crisis of confidence, because they're looking for perfect answers when there are none. They're looking for being able to deliver through sheer effort solutions which are not going to work perfectly out of the gate. So we are stressing not only our employees and our colleagues, but also our leadership and our talent at the same time. So being a digital leader in this time, I think, means you have to have more on your mind than just the operational or functional well-being of your organization. So I'm recommending to people, although it seems weird saying that we're all spending too much time on Zoom, over-communicate. Get yourself out there, share what's going on with a wide audience, not just your small teams, because we're already insular and isolated as a result of this. That would be very easy to set in stone, and that's not good for an organization as a whole. But also be authentic and recognize that, as I say, there are no perfect answers to this. We're all trying to figure it out together. We're all going to make mistakes. What we can do is learn. And one of the things I've been fascinated by is how individuals in their personal lives are adapting to the lockdown. Because I think there are lessons that we can learn as organizations about, how do you remain social, and how do you foster an environment where you have that social engagement, because that's a big part for many people. Work is their social life.
There's a point, actually, Peter, I jokingly made yesterday. Normally when I'm traveling to the office, around the offices, I get home and, reasonably see my wife. My wife made a comment the other day that since I've been working from home, she sees less of me than when I'm working in a normal pattern. And I think you're right. There's something about that. We've introduced virtual tea breaks, coffee breaks, and I'm amazed. I thought I knew a lot about people, being what I thought was a good leader, but actually seeing people's pets, their backgrounds and their family and their interaction has actually been great. I've really enjoyed the dogs, cats, snake and the odd spider gate crashing meetings. And I think you find more about people really from that point of view, because sometimes at work, the imposter syndrome, we paint a picture of how we like to be perceived. And I think when you're in your home environment, you relax a little bit. But the distractions, the dogs, the cats, the kids, the wife coming in to grab things, I think that's changed. For me, I've actually enjoyed learning more about my widespread team, and in fact across the company, because we have a weekly get together across the company with quizzes and random things and bits and pieces. And it's amazing how many people have different views that you wouldn't normally get from an office thing. So there are positives like that, I agree, but the work-life balance for me, as I mentioned the other day, is challenging. And if it's challenging for me, I know it's challenging for my staff. And I have to say to them, don't do as I do, or do as I say, take time off and take time out. We've actually actively looked in this period, because so when this first kicked off, we had everybody cancelling their leave, the holiday they booked. And we actually physically, as an executive leadership team, had to go back and say, with the help from our people services, actually, people, it's okay to take leave. You need to take leave. You need to have that break, even if it's just staying at home and having just taken 4 days off, a long weekend. I agree with that sentiment. We need to stop and take the time to recharge our batteries, spend a bit of family time, and then come back, even if it's just a short, extended weekend. And there's something around there that I think we as leaders need to make sure that our people do, and actually do it ourselves.
Yeah, I think one thing that which is quite interesting, and it'd been great to hear from other companies as well what's happening. But we've noticed that some of our sort of employees and freelancers that we work with have lost a sense of purpose without being in the office. They've kind of, where they're around people, they have this energy and they've got this kind of feeling to the deeper mission, and then on their own they suddenly lose that sense of energy. And I think that's the big challenge that a lot of leaders will have, is to create and maintain that sense of purpose and mission about why you're working for this organization, because it can get lost when you're suddenly just on your own or in your own place. And I think that seems to be one of the longer term challenges that might end up we're encountering whilst we're in this era.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's almost like it's really changing the shape of what we all know this, what work and what professionalism means even. We have a couple other questions from the audience as well. So I'm going to just branch out into these a little bit. And this ties in with sort of taking a break. Somebody mentioned about presenteeism as being a bit of an issue as well, and how that affects people when you're working digitally. It's difficult enough to imagine when people are in the same physical meeting room. How are we able to keep everybody's attention when they're all in different spaces, in different rooms, and working in different environments? I don't know if that's something that you have any opinions on. I'm going to go to Steve with this one first.
So, just before I came here, I was actually on a 3-hour ops board meeting. So, and at the end of that, we all sat down and discussed we need to find a better way of doing that. You cannot sit for 3 hours where we would normally do that in an office, and actually, Inda makes a point, get the energy off each other. We use the word to describe it's a little bit turgid at the end of it and a little bit difficult, and actually getting people's participation. And then when there's something emotive comes on, we all talk at once, and we sort of lost that. In a room, you can see, you talk, and you pick up on people's tone and inflections when they finish, where they come to the end of a sentence and you join in. So we've actually taken a decision on that. And I have to agree, because at the end of each day, my ears want to divorce my body after being sat with the headphones on all the time. I haven't worn headphones so long since I left the military a long time ago in the Royal Air Force. But I do think we need to look at it. And I'm sort of coming more to the fact, as Peter mentioned earlier, a bit of discipline about what you do in the meetings, short pieces, make sure people know what they're there. And if there are options. I mean, I love the whiteboard sessions with my team, and I miss the whiteboarding, how we do that. And I've not found a way of doing that virtually yet. I know you can get virtual whiteboards, but it's not the same. So yeah, I think that personal bit, how you allocate time, how you use it, I don't have the answers yet, and we're still working through that in our organization, how we get the benefit, and it's difficult. Just to maintain that cohesion, but I like what Inda said, the energy. For me, in that meeting, it was a good meeting. We achieved what we set out to do, but the energy was flat. Even with the tea break halfway through, so to speak, it was not quite the same on that personal interaction level. Even using the chat function in Zoom didn't really help.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to share something that came out of my experience in workshops, running workshops, and it's a technique that was designed to mitigate the effects of the charismatic leader or the hippo dominating the conversation. And I'll explain why it's pertinent. It was important to me during some workshops, which were part of understanding a corporate culture, that everybody participated. So I introduced something called working alone together. And what that meant was that we would put a proposition forward, so a debate point, something we would like to talk about. And then I asked everybody to work alone and just write down 3 things that came into their head. No conferring, no looking over somebody else's shoulder, but each of you write something down. And then we would very quickly go around the table and share those 3 things. And there was inevitably some duplication. There were some interesting points of view, but there were a couple of rules that we had in place at the same time. The first of which was no interrupting, no challenging, no defending. So you said your piece. Nobody interrupted you. Nobody said, yes, but, or you didn't feel like you had to defend your statement. And when a group had managed to share the point, then we would open it up to a group discussion. So we would pick out perhaps some of the key themes or some of the surprising themes. And that was a way that not only did everybody speak, they all had to engage, because you just couldn't sit there and not do something without it becoming obvious. Now, you have to balance that. There are obviously people who are more reticent about coming forward than others. Clearly not me. But I found that was a good way of not only maintaining energy and engagement, but keeping everybody involved at the same time.
It's a really good point. I wonder if there's so many of these, I guess, really influential workshop techniques which are typically used in physical environments, and maybe it is a case of kind of going back to them and understanding how they could be tweaked and applied to modern technology in this context. I'm sure there's definitely a lot that we could learn from that.
Yeah, I think to Steve's point about the virtual whiteboard, I mean, I've tried doing it as well with some of these techniques. It's not easy unless you've got a tablet with a stylus. But what you can do is pick out some of the points that you raise and then use something like my favorite variation on the 4-box model, which is about what we value. And so I have 4 boxes, the 2 axes, what we do and don't do that our customers value or don't value. And we would put some of those points into each of those boxes and say, well, we do something, our customers don't value it, but we have to do it because of compliance, or we do something that we think is really cool and nobody else cares, or we're not doing something that our customers would really like. So there are some of these creative tools that stimulate discussion. Now, that's all by and by, when at the moment, a lot of organizations are stretching themselves to just survive what's going on right now. And I think that's a question that's coming up that we certainly should be thinking about, is we've got to get a balance between dealing what's going on right now and being ready for the future, because this too will pass. And what I would hope is that we can preserve the best of what we get out of this enforced inflection point. And we also recognize the value of some of the things to say that previously perhaps we rather took for granted, like those water cooler moments, those informal conversations that now we have to schedule time for.
Mm. Yes, that's really, really good point. I think I'm going to move to one of the last questions, which we might actually kind of go quite deep on this, because I know it's something that we all have really thought about and discussed in our meetings prior to this. This is a question that's from Charles Ewan. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. He says, I think that on the work from home or not, and any relationship with mental health, that we are all different. Neurodiversity is something that we're doing a lot of work on, and surprise, surprise, we are all different, and one size does not fit all. as we know. He would like to have some comments on providing support applying to any work arrangements, including on-premise, in relation to that.
Oh, I guess I ought to lead on this as the behaviourist. So, it's an incredibly important point. The reason I got into behaviour is this is, by the way, this is not natural for me. If anybody's done Myers-Briggs, I'm an INTJ. That's called the scientist class. And what that really means is if you want to have a discussion with me, bring data, not emotions. Yep. But at the outset, I said for the last 4 years, I've been really interested in combining the best of the quant sciences of data science with behavioral science, because everybody is different. But we are driven by many of the same kinds of things. So right now, if you think every decision has some element of emotion in it, and therefore that's driving behavior, but every decision is a combination of some rational needs, and right now, you know, a lot of that is actually really low Maslow's hierarchy stuff. You know, where am I going to get money from? How can I pay my bills? Where am I going to get food? Or a few weeks ago, where am I going to find toilet roll? But there's also the emotional weight that we get out of those. So every individual, it's partly their own journey. So how did they get to the point they are? There's no other way of doing this. If you are a leader, then you have to get to know your people, not intrusively. And I would certainly say don't barrage them with psychometric tests or surveys. Yeah, there's one thing I'm absolutely convinced of from my experience of gathering data. If you want to know how somebody feels, don't ask them how they feel. None of us know how to answer that question. Or those of us that are in employment know that there are certain answers you just don't give. Like, I don't trust the strategy of this organization. My boss, you, are not a very nice person. So, but what you can do is get them to tell stories. Because when we share anecdotes and stories, because we're social animals, we add a lot of flavor in terms of emotion and motivation and our perspective. So take some time out to have those little sidebar conversations where you get to know people, and the way to get them to tell you about themselves is to get them to describe things. But then there are the obvious things that you can do. So I mentioned imposter syndrome, which is going to cause burnout from some of our highest performers. You have got to find ways to get them to limit their stress. As Steve said, manage the workload. 14-hour days is not sustainable in the long term. So you've got to take some time out. You've got to take some time to think a little bit differently. But I think it comes down to nothing more than spend the time to get to know your people, which also means do not have 100 direct reports. I actually think that the best leaders have a close community of between 7 and 10 that they regularly interact with, and then occasionally check in with other people to make sure they're getting a sense of a wider operational perspective. So I'll stop there for a moment to give my colleagues a chance to talk as well. But as I say, for me, get to know your people, get genuinely interested in what they're interested and worried about, but also try to think a little bit about what does that mean in terms of what I'm asking for from them from a work environment.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think there's probably two ways that I would look at it. There's the kind of the long-term operational like implementation of mental health practices within your organization. So I'm seeing some things like companies setting up employee hotlines, which are, you know, the employees can tap into experts from psychology or doctors. I think there's that, which are longer term investments, for example. But I think what Peter was saying is much more on the soft skill side of things, of being a leader. And it's also really important to introduce mental health language within the workspace. I think terms like anxiety, we're seeing it being thrown around a lot more now. And in some workplaces, that term would have never really been heard before, in terms of like, you know, hearing your boss talk about anxiety. So I think it's really important that leaders start introducing this language, and actually that starts the conversation for people to think about it, to say, actually, is that what I'm feeling? Is, you know, so it is the language, I think, will help people understand what they're going through as well quite a lot. So I think, yeah, definitely two sides: the long-term investments which need to be made, and then, you know, the individual techniques that, you know, leaders will use to really help drive this conversation and make people feel comfortable enough to, you know, address their own situation.
Mm-hmm.
There's some interesting points Charles mentioned about neurodiversity, and we're all unique in that. And we actively look at neurodiversity as a recruitment and to recruit from that area. But it's interesting, one of the things we had to consider when we did this, there are some of my team have certain requirements of how they need to work and function. And one thing that we missed the step, only a very small step when we first started, was to make sure that when they were home, that was taken into consideration. But I do agree with both Inda and Peter's comments. You know, we've got to look at both sides of this, how it works. I like the fact that we're using the language more now, where we use anxiety, stress, or resilience, whatever your flavor is. But we're having more open conversations, whereas before, sometimes it was always something, particularly from my generation, you kept to yourself. You never mentioned that you didn't feel confident or impostor syndrome. It was, I'm okay, great, crack on. And so I think it's changing our view there. I also think that the way that we use technology and get people to interact with technology is going to be a challenge moving on from here. And the other side of the coin there from me, or the third side, if there's a third side to it, the edge of the coin, not heads or tails, the edge, is that technology and what that means to people and how we use it and how they feel using it. There's something we haven't spoken much about that to this degree at the moment. But yeah, it's an interesting area. And I think this is an area that we as leaders should look more closely at and not be afraid to have open conversations. Like Peter said, not come out and write, how are you doing? Tell me what's your deepest, darkest secrets, because really I'm not interested. I get to know the people, understand that. The story thing, Peter, I think was a brilliant idea. I quite like that, and I'm going to pinch that. So yeah, I think it's interesting how we approach that, and people's needs, wants, and requirements in their work and social life. We need to balance all of it across the piece. Now we can't just be responsible for them at work and look at their needs, because we've changed that now. Work, home, it's all linked.
And I'm not sure that that's necessarily a good thing either, because we were previous talking about the stress of being always on, always available. There are a couple of things to watch out for. Everybody has a stress mode. So if you subscribe to Myers-Briggs or not, I don't really mind. But apparently, I'm a big picture thinker, but when I'm stressed, I go into micro detail and short repetitive tasks. So you can see that there are changes in behavior are a warning sign. Also, you can't go back and retrofit knowing somebody from before. If you weren't interested in your staff before, it's not going to feel very authentic if you suddenly come along and see, I know exactly how you feel. But I would say, one of the real warning signs, look out for those sudden changes in behavior. When somebody is, having gone from a very regimented, work-home life, seem to be putting in very long hours, productivity might be going all over the place, or they're making superhuman efforts. Because say those stress modes, they're almost always an opposite to how we would normally behave. But none of us are in the normal mode right now.
Of course. Thank you so much, Peter. A last thought from you, Inder, and then we're going to have to finish the session.
No, I think it's been really, really inspiring. I think we've covered quite a lot of ground on this. There's definitely,
I feel like yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think just be interesting to see how companies, again, appeal to your staff individually on a one-to-one level. Think about what processes can be put in to make people feel involved and to create purpose within your organization, where sometimes that can get lost when you're working on your own.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Thank you both so much. From here, delegates, please feel free to go to the live demos, which are in the expo area to the left-hand side. And I think there might also be some network roulette going on. And we will see you back here on the main stage for our final session at 2:25 with Kim Larson from Heathrow. All right. Thank you guys so much. Fantastic. Take care.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.